democratization in Southeast Asia has long drawn much academic and policy-making attention. This panel reviews the current status of democracies in individual Southeast Asian countries and their future prospects. It will also investigate the overall trend of democratic change and progress in the region as a whole.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the panel on Southeast Asia. We're going to address questions of where individual Southeast Asian countries stand on the democratic spectrum. I guess in Malaysia, we find out on Sunday where there's perhaps for the first time a real chance of change of government. In Singapore, PAP likewise has had to confront the fact that people are not entirely satisfied with a government that's ruled since independence, or since it split from Malaysia. In Indonesia, we've had reformasi and changes of leadership. We face in next year, SBY will leave office. It's not clear what's going to happen there. In the Philippines as well, we had the end of Marcos and a country that appeared to have lost its way until surprisingly re-emerged under the new president as perhaps the most viewed as the most dynamic economy in Southeast Asia, which was certainly a surprise to me. And finally, what is going on in Myanmar? How do we interpret the cause and consequences of this unexpected political change? What is the government there? What are the individuals in Myanmar trying to achieve? So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel. I recognize that it's late on the second afternoon, so we're going to make them work for their chance in the limelight. I'd like to introduce Dr. Lee. He's a research fellow at the Center for ASEAN and Oceania Studies at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Lee was a research fellow at the Korea Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. His most recent publication is Transnational National Disasters, Environmental Issues in East Asia. But I think he's going to give us an overview of where he believes democracy in Southeast Asia is going. Please carry on.
Thank you, David. I guess this panel is the only one that we don't have to talk about China and the US. We heard a lot of stories about China, US competition, and pressure and everything. So, well, I'm quite relieved that, but on the other hand, the democracy in Southeast Asia is fantastic topic to discuss, but at the same time, it's a topic that is very hard to handle because of diversity in Southeast Asia. I mean, one of the famous slogans of ASEAN is unity in diversity. So true to the slogan, you know, the current situation of democracy in Southeast Asia shows such a wide diversity. I mean, we can find a country which is close to absolute monarchy and one-party dominance and one-party rules and ambiguous democracies. Of course, some countries are democratic, and until recently we have seen strong military dictatorship in Myanmar. I cannot go through all the 10 or 11 countries in Southeast Asia, so I just pick up 4 countries, and then I divided these countries into 2 groups. The first group is Malaysia and Singapore. Malaysia and Singapore is often called illiberal democracies, semi-democracies, and so on. The symptom of democracies in these 2 countries is that we are surprised, not really surprised, but we were happy to see the rapid economic development in these 2 countries. With the economic development, there was a substantial increase of middle class in these 2 countries, which is expected to be an engine for democratic demands in these 2 countries. But obviously, many people categorize these 2 countries not quite democratic. These two countries have held regular elections since their independence, but at the same time, the same parties have dominated the political scene. The dominant ruling party never have lost in elections so far. At the same time, there's a little bit of limits on civil liberty in these two countries. But surprisingly, the electoral support from the people for the ruling parties not really comes on by coercion, but constituency, the people on voluntary basis, they support those ruling parties in these two countries. So there are two clashing arguments. One is that this form of a democracy in Malaysia and Singapore is sustainable. This is particular, Asian type of democracy. This is one argument. But on the other hand, there are people who are arguing for these two countries' democracy is on the way to kind of universal Western-style democratic politics. Especially this kind of debate between the two arguments become very hard when there is an electoral setback of the ruling parties. For example, in Malaysia in 1999 election and the 2008 election, in Singapore 2011 election, when the ruling parties experience some setback, then this kind of debate springs up. Okay, at the moment, I cannot predict if these democracies will move on to the kind of Western democracies or will stay there. But what I can say is that what kind of elements sustains these kind of ambiguous democracies in Southeast Asia? I got two factors here. The first one is obviously economic development. So the people recognize the ruling parties' economic performance, so they give vote for the ruling parties. It's got two different aspects. One is that the expectation for the continuous economic development in this country under those ruling parties. But on the other hand, the people have kind of fear that if the ruling party is gone and opposition party takes the power, then their economic prosperity will be gone. So, and on the other hand, these ruling parties have their own ideological underpinning, which extract people's voluntary support for the ruling parties. For example, in Singapore, there is a well-known term called politics of survival. In this small island with no resource, small, that when they become independent, many people were not sure if this country can survive. I mean, Singapore, 80% of the population is ethnic Chinese, but it's surrounded by the ethnic Malay Indonesian, for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines as well. So this kind of siege mentality or politics of survival has been reminded by the ruling parties repeatedly to the people. So this kind of siege mentality extract political support for the ruling party. Of course, if you look at Malaysia, there is the fear of ethnic disputes. If ethnic dispute or conflict erupts in Malaysia, then everyone will lose what they have. This kind of fear has been reminded by the ruling parties to the people. And I will move on to the second set of countries, Indonesia and Philippines. These two countries are obviously categorized as a democratic polity in Southeast Asia by definition. But there's a catch. These two countries still is dominated, the politics is dominated by handful of elites, and the corruption is kind of everywhere. And party politics is not stable yet. And for example, if you look at the Philippines, then there are rampant extrajudicial killings, especially during the election time. And if you look at the Indonesia, I mean, the administrative power and the governance is not so well set up, and it's not so well, it's not widespread compared to the widespread of democratic freedom in these two countries. So the question is why the Philippines and Indonesia do not live up to the expectation of the democratic politics. There could be many reasons to explain this, but in the Philippines, one of the problem is tightly knitted patron-client relationship, which has deep root in Philippine society. Those of a handful of the rich families dominate the politics, economy, and everything. It causes kind of inequality in economics and inequality in politics, political power, and this kind of social contradiction causes political irregularities in this in the Philippines. And if you look at Indonesia, well, I'm more positive on Indonesia, so I see kind of a room for the benefit of a doubt. I mean, Indonesia is still a young democracy, and obviously it's very hard to democratically elevate Indonesia, given the population and the size of the country and the level of social and economic development. Okay, so my intention for this talk is just to browse these four countries' current status of democracies. I don't have a definite answer in which direction these four countries will move, but I clearly can say that there's no chance for these four countries to step back to authoritarian politics, but at the same time, I'm not certain that I'm not quite sure that if these four countries will advance toward a fuller Western type of democracy. Okay, I will stop here.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting point you made about cronyism and concentration of economic power in Indonesia and the Philippines. It's certainly the case in my experience working in Malaysia that UMNO and Barisan Nasional means one thing, and distributing money and contracts to your supporters. I'd like to introduce Dr. Limaye, who is the director of the East-West Center in Washington. He is a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses and is the editor of the journal Global Asia on the International International Advisory Council of the journal Contemporary Southeast Asia. Dr. Limaye, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and again, thanks to the Asan Institute. I'm delighted to be on this panel, and I hate to disappoint Dr. Lee, but I'm going to introduce both the US and China a little bit into this discussion, in part because it enters the discussion.
Okay.
So it focuses on external factors, quite apart from the internal dynamics of democratization in the countries that you typologized as either illiberal democracies or semi-democracies or flawed democracies. There are many terms that can be used, I suppose, and our good colleague Christopher is an expert on democratic theory as well. I guess I would put it this way, where the US and China enter this picture, and then I'll go a little bit into the democracies and make a couple of points. The first is that in the debate about Asia-Pacific democracy, whether Roland Rich's book about Pacific Asian democracies or Ben Riley's recent work in the Journal of Democracy, China is stated as both a requirement for democratization in the region. And I would just read the phrase from Roland Rich's book, which, if you have not read, is really well worth reading. On page 283, he says that it is difficult to see how a civilizational consensus in favor of democracy, he's talking about Pacific Asia, can emerge without China's concurrence. And Ben Riley recently argued in the pages of Journal of Democracy that one reason that mainland Southeast Asia does not move towards democratization or is farther away from democratization is because China inhibits that through its tributary relationship and its historiography. And in fact, one of the reasons that China is so nervous about the US-Burma rapprochement is because it could potentially break authoritarian regimes across mainland Southeast Asia. So I don't want to overdo the point, but simply to state that writers on democracy, such as Ben Riley and Roland Rich, have both argued in one way or another that the China factor is important in democratization or democracy building in the region. Now, I will tell you that Roland and I participated in several panels and we discussed this issue. I was his commentator, wrote a review of his book in the Journal of Democracy. I don't agree with him. I don't believe that China has to be a democracy for others in Southeast Asia to be a democracy. But I find Ben Riley's comments about mainland Southeast Asia quite intriguing. If there are, in fact, historical reasons why mainland Southeast Asia has had more difficulty in establishing democracy. And it's not always the case. We have Thailand as an outlier. I mean, Thailand has had its bouts of democracy as well as bouts of non-democracy. So that's one point. The second point I wanted to make is about the U.S. For the U.S. in the pivot, one of the key elements of our pivot, which gets very little attention because so much of the emphasis is on military and moving 60-40 of our naval forces and what we're doing on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of which are very important, is that human rights and democracy is an important element of our policy. And it's an element in two ways. It facilitates the ability to do things with democracies in the region because it has more support in the U.S. public and in the U.S. Congress. It makes it more difficult to do things with countries that are non-democratic because there will be resistance and a lack of consensus in Congress. So there are elements in which external factors could help. And Burma, of course, is a primary case and a question raised in this panel, is how far can we go with Burma? How far should we go with Burma? In fact, those who have criticized American rebalance policy, some of the most interesting criticisms have not come on the U.S.-China relationship or the security relationship, but in the context of whether or not the U.S. is moving forward with rebalance in situations that don't merit it on grounds of democratization or human rights, or militaries that have been in one way behaved improperly or illegally, or ones we should not be associated with. It played an important role even, for example, in the negotiations in the U.S.-Indonesia Comprehensive Partnership. Our dealings with Kopassus, the Special Forces of Indonesia, was an important element of issues discussed as we move forward with an emerging partnership with Indonesia. All of which is to say that while China and the U.S. are obviously not critical to the internal domestic dynamics of democratization or not democratization, they are important variables that shape the discussion and the outcomes, and ones that should not be ignored. Let me turn to the second point. The second point I would make is this question of these large categories that will shape outcomes outside of China and the U.S. And Dr. Lee referred to the two groups that he sought to focus on. There's sort of, to me, three big issues. One is modernization theory. And I think our colleague Larry Diamond, in his very interesting article in The Atlantic about the future of East Asian democracy, posits the notion, and he's optimistic about East Asian democracy, in part because he sees modernization taking root. And that means increased per capita income, the growth of the middle class, the development of education and literacy, more information, accountability, transparency, all of which I think are well worth taking into account. But there are also cautions on other grounds. There are cautions on the grounds that there are political cultures in each of these countries that have limitations on how far they're willing to democratize. Now, I can tell you, I have no idea what the balance is between these. But I raise both modernization theory and elite political cultures because I think they are important parentheses within which the democratization dynamic works. And then let me finally end with something that Dr. Lee did allude to, which is issues of corruption and governance. And even for electoral democracies that have had sustained changes of political leadership through free and fair elections, I think we can see across the region a number of difficulties in consolidating good governance, in consolidating the nation and state building process, whether it's ethnic, religious, linguistic, regional differences. And that, I think, is the second step to electoral democracies and free and fair elections. And I think there's lots of work to be done in Southeast Asia on those issues. And then finally, let me end with Burma. I think it is improper to call what's happening in Burma democratization. What is happening there is a kind of internal regime readjustment. I've thought of lots of ways to describe this. I frankly don't have a good description. But it cannot be called democratization. And I am very hopeful that what happens in Burma, Myanmar will be positive and will open up the system. But as we saw in the early years of Indonesian transition too, there are hiccups, there are difficulties. Again, the democratization process occurs within a larger, deeper nation and state building project in all of these countries. And therefore we can expect some difficulties from moving from an announced declaration of opening to a fully consolidated democratization. So let me end there with those comments. Dave.
I mean, I think those are all very valid points. I mean, in Burma, Myanmar, whatever you choose to call it, the elite appears to have monetized its ill-gotten military gains. Throughout Southeast Asia, we have elites who are exercising power. Dr. To, well, Dr. To's Malaysian. You can read his bio. With Dr. To, more than any other panelists, we'll know by Sunday whether he's right or not. Malaysia has an election. UMNO, Barisan Nasional, whatever its various incarnations, has won 12 of the 13 elections. Dr. To, what's going to happen this time? The question I always had when I was in Malaysia is, can Barisan Nasional surrender? Can UMNO surrender power? Can the opposition govern? Can it take power? What's your expectation of the result? What are going to be the consequences if the government loses, or indeed if the opposition loses? They mobilize people on the streets quite frequently. And how on earth can you keep a PAS, DAP, secular coalition together under the strains of government? You have PAS pushing for political Islam, you have the DAP pushing for a largely secular respect of individual rights. The two simply can't tally, can they?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, fellow panelists. I'd like to begin with the usual compliments. I'd like to thank Asan Institute for bringing me a great expense here. Okay, we are supposed to talk about democracies in Southeast Asia, essentially looking at the status of democratic development in the various Southeast Asian countries, and maybe talk a little about developments in the Philippines and Indonesia and Myanmar. I probably will answer some of your questions later in order not to be off balance. I've prepared something, so I'll follow my text not necessarily very closely, and then towards the end, I will sure address some of the issues that you have brought up, Mr. Chairman. I thought before we can evaluate the development of democracy in Southeast Asia, we first have to refresh our minds with what are some of the essential features of the framework and institutions of a mature democracy. Essentially, the framework comprises a basic constitution which guarantees personal security and private property and all sorts of freedoms, freedoms of association, assembly, worship, and so on. And for countries that have a monarchy, it should only be a constitutional monarchy, not an autocratic one. And then universal suffrage, one man, one vote, and hopefully the elections will be free and fair. And they haven't been in my country for sure. And we do hope that this time there will be some improvements. and then free periodic elections by secret ballot. So these are some of the basic framework. And there must be certain key institutions like elected federal, state, and local government, separation of powers between the executive, legislature, and judiciary, high degree of political organization, representation, mobilization, and competition among legal parties, independent mass media, and most Southeast Asian countries, by the way, don't have that. Our rankings by the, I think, Reporters Without Borders for the whole of Southeast Asia are generally quite low. Professional, non-partisan bureaucracy, and exclusion of military and police forces from intervention in politics. Okay, now, in short, if these are complied with fully, then we should have a fairly representative, fairly inclusive, fairly fair and just electoral and political system, a fairly inclusive and representative democracy with no concentration of power in a small group of elites. And this also means that there will be good governance and, equally importantly, transparency in decision making. But what really is the reality? I mean, these are sort of ideals, but have these been complied with? Now, before I go on to evaluate, I must not forget the importance of civil society, and later I'll explain to you how a burgeoning and growing civil society has played a key role in creating the space for democratic dissent in my country, and which actually has led to a more competitive political system, which hopefully will lead to, well, I wouldn't use the term regime change, but certainly a change in the party that governs after Sunday. I'll talk a little more about that later. Now, actually, Malaysia achieved independence in 1957. I'm going to talk a little more about Malaysia only because I'm a Malaysian and I know a bit more about Malaysia than I do other Southeast Asian countries. And this explains why I will be talking a lot more about Malaysia. But I will also say something about the Philippines later. Now, over the years, we have witnessed a decline in governance. In other words, we have actually seen a process of what we call de-democratization. The ruling elites in the ruling coalition called the Barisan Nasional, which in English means the National Front, has taken a very cavalier attitude towards the constitution, as they have not quite complied with the provisions of the constitution, certainly not with regards to freedoms of association, freedoms of assembly, and so forth. There's been parliamentary domination by one party, by one coalition. Interestingly, Malaysia is one of the few countries, perhaps the only country, that so-called practices democracy that has not actually seen a change of party in power. The Barisan Nasional has ruled all through from 57 till today, for a total of, 56 years? Even in Japan, they had a change of party in power, but not Malaysia. And we do hope to change that. And the powers of incumbency and the resources of the state in the conduct of elections have been abused. The ruling coalition's contempt for the role of the opposition in parliament. I mean, there's been absolutely no, not much space, rather, given to the opposition, to play their role as an effective force, to contest and debate policies by the ruling coalition. Dissent, instead of being institutionalized, is being increasingly not tolerated. Now, the attitude of the ruling coalition towards dissent has been one of growing and intensifying intolerance. So, opposition has been repressed, likewise civil society, and that has seen a steady diminution of the freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. There's been tremendous resort to gerrymandering, which means redrawing boundaries of constituencies in order to benefit the ruling coalition. But interestingly, the way they have drawn it is actually coming to haunt them in the coming elections, because of the shift in the moods and the shift in the attitudes of voters, the very constituencies that used to favor the ruling coalition are now not anymore favoring them. So they're finding the coming elections tough. And domination of mass media by legislative prohibition, bureaucratic regulation, police surveillance, and corporate ownership. So in other words, we don't have a free media. And our rankings, as I've said, on this international ranking of, media freedom is actually very low, partly because of legal prohibition. Owners of the mainstream, owners of the media are either in the hands of the ruling parties or by corporations that have friendly ties with the ruling coalition. Now, from that kind of decline, it has actually further degraded over the last few years. The concentration of power in the executive, from the judiciary, from the bureaucracy, and from other branches of government has actually been on the increase. So we don't now have an independent judiciary as such, so they expect the judiciary to do an independent review of state conduct in various areas of government. It's not on. So, and as I've said, there's hardening of legislative, bureaucratic, and police restrictions on constitutional freedoms. The media, by virtue of being controlled by the ruling coalition, has been used in a very massive way to actually harass opposition and to promote the government, and resort to non-electoral methods of undermining opposition state governments. And of course, finally, and very importantly, the state has also resorted to detention without trial for a long time, until consistent and massive opposition has led them to amend that law called the Internal Security Act. But we can still be detained without trial, but the period of detention without being brought to court has now been shortened. Or the period of detention before your detention can be further extended has been shortened. So that's the situation in Malaysia up until recently. Now the interesting thing, however, is the emergence of civil society. Given that the situation has become rather intolerable, we have witnessed and seen the growth of rather very vocal groups. And one of the groups that I must pay some attention to, and which I must actually relate the story to you all, is an organization called Bersih. Bersih is a Malay term for clean. And Bersih is a civil society organization comprising of many non-governmental organizations that have gotten together to fight for clean and fair elections. Bersih, of which I'm also a member of the steering committee, recognizes that unless elections are free and fair, unless improvements are made to the electoral system, there's no way that the electoral system can be made more contestable. There's no way that Barisan Nasional, the ruling coalition, can be challenged. And much to our surprise, pleasantly of course, when we organized a couple of rallies as a result of our memorandums not getting the favorable response, the response to the two protests that we organized was just overwhelming. At the second one, something like 200,000, although official figures had it at only about 20,000-30,000, 200,000 people gathered in the streets of Kuala Lumpur to demand for clean and fair elections. We put forward 8 demands, but so far only one has been accepted, which is the use of indelible ink. The reason why we propose that, of course, is to avert multiple voting by the same individual. Our electoral roll is full of phantom voters. As I've said, there's abuse of government machinery to favor the ruling coalition. Briberies are resorted to, and so on and so forth. And the resort to all these have partly explained why, explained partly why the Barisan Nasional has been able to stay in power for such a long time. Plus, of course, the resort to the use of ethnic issues. I'm sure most of you know that Malaysia is a multiracial country comprising primarily of Malays, the indigenous group, Chinese, like myself, Indians, and also indigenous groups in the eastern part of Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak. But by merely playing on the fears of the Malays that, if you don't vote United Malays National Organization in to rule continuously, then you risk your interests being unprotected, and that economically especially, there's no way you can compete, and that the gap between the Malays and the Chinese will continue to grow. And that has worked for quite a while, actually, but because of the growth of a Malay middle class as a result of certain affirmative action, and because of rampant corruption, and because of the use of state power to nurture a group of crony capitalists amongst the Malay elites themselves, the Malay middle classes and the Malay poor see through the UMNO scheme of things. And many of them are beginning to revolt. But they are supporting PAS. They are supporting PAS. So, and PAS is working with the Democratic Action Party, which is largely a Chinese-based party, and another party called the Justice Party, which is led by Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim, whom many of you might know of. He was actually the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia under Dr. Mahathir Mohamad for a long time, until he was sacked on charges of sodomy and corruption. But all these have been proven to be lies, and Anwar now is leading the opposition movement called the People's Coalition to challenge Barisan Nasional in the forthcoming elections, which will be held in a few days' time. I will be rushing back on the 4th to vote in the elections to be held on the 5th of May. So I'll maybe discuss more later on the situation in Malaysia, especially in response to questions if you have any. But let me now just very quickly run through the case of Philippines. I think in the case of the Philippines, there's an absence of a strong and stable party system, which has led to shifting alliances amongst political leaders and a lack of genuine ideological competition. The capture of the state by big business elites has led the state to pursue and implement policies that are largely pro-capital, while the development of patron-client ties, the tendency to resort to gold, electoral fraud and glamour, and the perpetuation of political clans have led to the inability of the electoral system to reflect the popular will. Ben Anderson himself has found that most members of the legislature are generally much richer, and they come from a few dynasties or families, and as a result, you have dynasties dominating the legislative and the presidential system. The last two presidents, for example, Gloria, she's the daughter of a previous president. The current president, Aquino too, is the son of a former president. And because of that, reforms that are intended actually to actually close the gap between rich and poor, for example, land to the landless through land reforms, have actually for a long time been blocked by the interests of landed aristocracy, which in turn has actually dominated the legislatures at various levels. Plus, of course, as a result of the weak state, you do have clans, especially in the provinces, that have their own armies and that use all these to actually intimidate the polity, the voters into supporting them. So essentially, what I want to say is that from my own observation, the democracies in most countries in Southeast Asia are oligarchic, with power actually concentrated in the hands of an oligarchy, and that, especially, and that in the words of Karl Trotsky, all the democratic forms, be it elected legislative bodies and executives, regular elections, political parties, written constitutions, and formal guarantees of political and individual human liberties, have become but part of the legitimizing apparatus of both Southeast Asian nations. So it's on this note that I end my presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting point you made about the Philippines, which you can extend to Malaysia. And Prime Minister Najib is the son of one prime minister and the nephew of another. And of course, the Lee family in Singapore continues to exercise great sway. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Christopher Walker, who's an executive director the National Endowment for Democracies, International Forum for Democratic Studies. Mr. Walker was Vice President for Strategy and Analysis at Freedom House in New York. His articles have appeared in a range of publications, including The Journal, The New York Times, Washington Post, and Barron's, and the Far Eastern Economic Review, Taipei Times, ForeignPolicy.com, and World Affairs. Mr. Walker, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you also to the organizers, the Asan Institute, for the invitation to this conference and to this panel. One of the benefits of going last in the order is you get to hear what your co-panelists say. One of the drawbacks to going last is that they probably have said some of the things you intended to say. So I may modify some of the observations I'd share. But what I'd like to do in short order is to touch on three issues, some of which has been touched on, but I might reframe things just a little bit differently, and then also touch on an aspect of China's role in the democratic governance equation in Southeast Asia. So first I'd like to touch on the political diversity in the region. Second, I'll touch on some of the trends that have emerged and some of the changes that have taken place. And third, talk about the China effect as it relates to democratic governance in the region. So as my fellow panelists have mentioned, the countries of Southeast Asia are rather diverse. You have one-party authoritarian states, you have multi-party democracies. The authoritarian systems might be considered as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Brunei. Countries such as Indonesia and the Philippines and Timor-Leste are young and in ways weak democracies. Some of these weaknesses were alluded to by some of my fellow panelists. You then have countries like Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia, which are middle performers. They have features of authoritarianism, some of the features of oligarchic influence, corruption, money politics, these sorts of things, to larger degrees in some of the other countries, perhaps, which push them along the scales in some of the indices that are out there. Burma was mentioned as a country which, for analytical purposes, is very tricky these days because, as a snapshot, it's still viewed by organizations like Freedom House as an authoritarian state, if you look at where they sit on the spectrum of countries. At the same time, there's been changes that are notable. One can debate the degree of meaningfulness and the degree of durability in the changes, but they are noteworthy. Whether it's simply authoritarian liberalization as opposed to meaningful democratization and transition, that's a debate. I suspect erring on the side of caution in the assessments of Burma is probably wise until we have more evidence in hand, and certainly the dominant power holders show more of a willingness to cede dominant control of the system there. If you look at Freedom House findings, essentially the Southeast Asia region breaks down into two of the large categories that Freedom House uses, which is not free and partly free. The one exception to that at the moment is Indonesia, which is in the free category. These categories have their limitations, but in essence what we're talking about are categories that demonstrate, in the case of the not free examples, systems that systematically deny safeguards and guarantees in terms of political rights and civil liberties. The countries that are in the middle category have some but not all of those. The countries that make their way into the free category have more of these safeguards and guarantees, but not necessarily all of them. If you move along the spectrum, you'd need to get to a country like Finland or Sweden, for example, to get to really exceptionally strong performers. If you move all the way across the scale to the weakest performers, you'd come to a country like North Korea or Turkmenistan. Dr. Woon mentioned his list of essential features for a complete democracy, and I noted with interest that the list he mentioned was very, very closely tracking the indicators that Freedom House uses in its assessment of political rights and civil liberties, and as fortune would have it, my former colleagues at Freedom House have shared with me some data relating to Southeast Asia, and I'll share with you some of the trajectory and some of the features, very brief order, to put some frame of reference on what's happened in key countries in the region. If you look over the last decade, in the three big categories I mentioned, that gives a very broad sweep, gives an indication of how things are moving at a very basic level in the region. You've had three of these category changes over the last decade. One country, Indonesia, moved from the middle category, partly free, to free. And I would note that Indonesia is just over the line there, so it's actually a rather weak free country as these things go. The Philippines fell from the free category to the partly free category, as did Thailand, which by virtue of its volatility and turmoil has a habit of shifting back pretty dramatically among these categories. I think more importantly, if you look within these categories, and for those of you who haven't taken a close look at the Freedom House data, I'd like to commend my former colleagues and commend you to the findings. You can actually get a better sense of what's happening within these broader categories by looking at some of the sub-indicators, a host of which Dr. Woon alluded to during his presentation a moment ago. If you look at broadly the sorts of areas that are soft or weak across the countries in the region, you'll find that consolidating the rule of law is one area which is problematic. Accountable governance is another, and media freedom in a number of these countries. And by that, I would emphasize the consequential dimension of media freedom. So not so much entertainment or these sorts of things, but politically consequential media. And I think Dr. Woon alluded to this in the Malaysian case. Media there comes under stress from some of the ownership holdings, the dominance there. Malaysia is one of these unusual countries in the new media sphere where online media has been a target of the authorities, and it's one of these instances where the online level of freedom, if you look at the metrics that are out there, is actually comparable in many ways to traditional media. What you find in many semi-authoritarian settings today is that traditional media, television, radio freedom tends to be weaker, less free, and online freedom tends to have relatively more freedom, at least for the time being. I think one of the phenomenon that we're seeing is that the space for online freedom in politically repressive settings is systematically shrinking, and I can explain that a little bit more later if there's interest. If we look at some of the specific sub-indicators, looking at the 11 countries that are within the region, rule of law over recent years underwent the most profound change. Functioning of government, which is another indicator, also went under very significant change. If we look at the rule of law indicator, countries that went under detectable, notable change were Cambodia and Brunei. The Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand also underwent negative change in this area. If we look for a little bit of good news, we mentioned Burma. The indicators that look at electoral process and political pluralism both underwent significant change in the Burma case, but I'd note that in this instance, because the start point was so profoundly weak, given the fact that Burma, before the period of recent opening, was among not only the region's most repressive countries, but the world's, there's quite a bit of room and space for improvement. So there, the relative improvement is rather good. Still has a long way to go to join the ranks of more impressive performers. So what's the upshot of this? What do these findings suggest? I think one of the things we can see in a region that has such extensive differentiation between these countries is that there's really an element of contestation in the way in which democratic governance is viewed and the way it's approached. One way to put this would be to say the conceptualization of what responsive governance is, I don't think is ironclad or settled on. These concepts are very squishy in general terms. You won't find a universally agreed to definition of good governance on the one hand. The definition democratic governance has emerged, and there too I don't think you'd find a universally accepted version of that. But I think this idea of good governance, responsive governance, is actually under contestation at the conceptual level in this region, in part because you have such a diversity of countries there, and by extension, and let's circle back to the China question, which was mentioned earlier, because of the China model and the China effect, which in recent years there's been, on the basis of China's economic growth, but suppression of political rights, a view not only in the region but beyond the region that this is an efficient model for establishing governance. And for authoritarian regimes, if we look in the region, Vietnam would, I think, be the best case of this, but also developing countries have looked at this. If you look at the comments and observations of leaders in sub-Saharan African countries, countries in the Middle East, you'll find them alluding to, in one shape or another, the China model. And I don't think we can discount this. I think, at least in the debate, it's an important factor to keep in mind in how we conceptualize these things. I think if you agree with the proposition that for regimes that have pursued this sort of model, that legitimacy is performance legitimacy largely emerging from economic performance, then the question arises, how do these systems fare when the shine isn't so positive in the economic sense? I think if you look at Vietnam in the recent period, we may have our first example of this, where it's become very difficult on a number of counts, and the authorities there have resorted to greater repression. And I think this too, if you push this out over time, whether this will lead to more durable, sustainable, and I would argue even stable governance and systems is a real question. And I think this is one of the aspects of the debate in the region which is now playing out, I would argue, in countries like Indonesia and Thailand, which have discussions on the question of what form of governance and what model is most effective for making improvements. But of course, in countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, it's also relevant because they are, by and large, more prone to look at the China model. So just a couple of final thoughts on this count. I think at the outset of the sessions yesterday, President Chung and also Stephen Krasner talked about the key dimension of domestic governance and thinking about the management of disorder. And then when they were elaborating some of the possible challenges on the horizon, they said, well, even if we're not going to go in great detail on the specific cases, the domestic governance equation is perhaps the most important one. And Stephen Krasner mentioned in the Chinese case that upheaval in China would probably come from some sort of inability to manage domestic affairs. On the one hand, observers both within and without the region have looked at the China model with some admiration. I think this is true perhaps most profoundly with columnist Tom Friedman. At the same time, a system that has runaway corruption, an inability to develop a system of rule of law or a judiciary that's independent, an inability to respect independent civil society raises real questions about the sustainability of the model and for its desirability as a model in the region, even if for the time being it's been viewed as such. And this is something I think will become more acute in the coming periods, certainly if the Chinese system reveals even more vulnerability than it has at the moment. I'll leave it at that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've probably just over 10 minutes left, so I'm going to invite the panelists to have a discussion. The main themes that appear to have come out of this are legitimacy of the government. Is it delivering what you, the people, expect, like PAP or UMNO Barisan Nasional? Rule of law, respect for the rule of law, and civil liberties. The other major theme was cronyism and elites. Another one was media. How does media, old media, state-controlled media, play out, or elite-owned media play out against the voices of non-mainstream media. And the one big question we really haven't discussed is political Islam, which is an issue in Malaysia, Indonesia, to some extent in the Philippines and in Myanmar, Burma as well. So if you could keep your comments brief, and you can address just one of those issues if you'd like to. Dr. Lee.
Yeah. Well, I see among these issues, I would like to pick up the cronyism and the media issues. The media, okay. The other day, it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Every day I commute from my hometown Suwon to Seoul, which is about 30 kilometers down south. And on the subway, I am used to listen to the Malaysian radio using my smartphone.
Yes.
It's a Mix FM 94.5 or something. And this radio station usually plays the American or European songs. But one day, obviously between the songs there's a commercial. And one day, I found an interesting song, Perjuangan Aku, which means my struggle or something. And some other songs which is emphasizing patriotism, and the lyrics was about how far the Malaysia has traveled so far and what kind of bright future we have. These kind of songs were played. Oh, what is it? I was wondering. And then, after the song, there was a news brief that the parliament was dissolved. This is the situation of Malaysian media. When the government was set to resolve the parliament, then the kind of instruction or order was given to the media to persuade. Now's the time to persuade the people to support the ruling party. Okay, that's it about the media. And the second one, the cronyism. Well, this is not really a cronyism, but I would like to elaborate more on the situation in the Philippines. During the Spanish colonial times, those people who were cooperative with the Spanish rule has been were rewarded with the huge land. They built their own farm, and so many people work in the farm because they were quite dependent on those rich landowners. Then the U.S. Colonial rule came in, and the U.S. didn't want to disturb the basic structure of the society, and just they introduced the political parties, elections, and so on. So these rich families, based on the support of those people who are dependent on this family, got easily elected to the parliament, national assembly, and higher position in the government. Then the story goes on and on and on like that. So that these small, a few hundred families dominating the politics and economy of the Philippines since then. These elites are the target to be reformed, but these people are the people who decide to reform or not. This is the basic contradiction in the Philippine society. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Dr. Limaye, no China, no United States in the final summing up. I'm sorry about that.
No, I don't know if I heard you say, maybe I just missed it, about, I thought one of the things that is at play, and maybe wasn't mentioned, was ethnic religious intolerance.
Political Islam.
Yes, I would identify that as probably amongst these, which we know well, cronyism, state elitism, as one of the things that does worry me in the region, and particularly what we've seen in Burma. I'll stop there because I know Chris and Dr. To will have a lot to say about this.
Dr. To.
I'll say something about political Islam. Yeah, okay. As I've said earlier, come this Sunday, we're going to have our general election, pitting two major coalitions. One, the current ruling coalition, called the National Front, which has UMNO, United Malays National Organization, and the other parties representing the other different ethnic groups. bundled together on the one hand, versus the People's Front, led by Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim, which comprises of only three parties, the People's Justice Party, the Islamic Party, and the Democratic Action Party. Now, one of the issues that is of concern, more to outsiders actually, rather than Malaysians, is whether in the event of the People's Coalition coming to power, will there be an Islamic State? And the reason why there's concern is because lately, especially during the campaigning, the Islamic Party has been insisting that should this opposition front come to power, it will definitely put in place the Islamic agenda and have Malaysia become an Islamic state. Now, one of the key proposals is what they call hudud law, which basically means if you're caught stealing, your hands will be chopped off. Well, now you might think that to non-Muslims, non-Muslims, Chinese, Indians, they will be most frightened, but instead they are actually rallying to support this opposition front and rallying to support this Islamic Party as well, hudud or Islamic State notwithstanding. And the reason is because they are all very united in wanting to bring down the National Front and put in place what they call a two-coalition system, because they know that it's only by breaking the hegemony of power and the monopoly of power by the National Front will all the excesses, all the abuses be hopefully brought down. Now, as to the possibility of implementing Islamic jurisprudence and the creation of an Islamic State should the People's Coalition come to power, well, I wouldn't rule out totally that there won't be certain conservative, even obscurantist measures being undertaken. Maybe in some places they might try to push that women hairdressers cannot cut the hair of men, men and women must sit separately in theatres, men here one side, women one side, that kind of thing, which you all are very familiar with. Now, what I want to stress is Party PAS is not a monolithic party. There are ulamas, there are religious leaders within the party that have been pushing and are still pushing for the creation of an Islamic State, for the resort to the use of Sharia as the basis of the legal system, rather than common law. But on the other hand, you also do have another group that, whilst they are in favor of an Islamic State, has a different interpretation of an Islamic State. To them, an Islamic State actually means a welfare state. An Islamic State is a state that cares for the well-being of the poor, housing for those without houses, good access to medical care, good access to good education, and so on and so forth, all of which actually make up a good Islamic agenda as well. So there will be a contestation, I think, between these two different factions, the way you have that in Turkey. Now, as to which of the two factions will emerge victorious and therefore have a greater impact on the agenda of the party and on the larger People's Front in the government, at that, it's yet to be seen. Although some people seem to suggest that the Ulama Council, the Council of Islamic Elders, seems to have the upper hand. We'll wait and see, but interestingly, Malaysians, including the non-Muslims who should fear the Islamic State most, are not afraid and are in fact raring to support this opposition front. So we're expecting a victory for the opposition front, and Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim, barring no obstacles, and there will probably be some obstacles even after the election, will be the next Prime Minister of Malaysia. Yeah, so.
Thank you, Dr. To. We have very little time left for Mr. Walker. Christopher, please.
Very briefly, I might touch on the media freedom issue, in part because World Press Freedom Day is upon us. I think if you look at the countries we've discussed, you'd see that a subset of them have authoritarian media systems which, in the absence of reform, it's very difficult to see deeper reforms emerging in the area of corruption, opening up the necessary artery of communication for political opposition, all the other things that are critical to democratic reform. This would be countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Brunei. I think Burma is an interesting case. As part of the reform ambitions that the optimists have for Burma, if we see the mass media sector liberalizing in a meaningful way, this would be a very good signal. My understanding is some real questions about some of the forces aligned with the dominant powers getting a foothold in key parts of the emerging new media system there. If that were to happen, it would raise questions about the real possibilities for meaningful reform in Burma. At the same time, you have the countries that I and my colleagues more or less put into either the middle performing category or the weak democracies category. There, too, you look at a country like the Philippines, it's undergone a profound erosion in its media freedom scores and Reporters Without Borders and Freedom House, in part because of violence against journalists, these horrible murders that have occurred in recent years. It's easy to imagine at a period of economic duress for the news media that in these middle-performing settings with poor ownership transparency, with the need for cash infusions coming from the sources that have them, that we may not be looking at such a rosy or relatively rosy media landscape, which would have real implications for improving anti-corruption efforts, improving the ability of civil society to get its message across. So I think this is really an area that's worth keeping an eye on in all the different topologies we've discussed here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for dealing so comprehensively with such a diverse set of countries. I hope people in the audience enjoyed it, and I'm sure they carry on for a long time. Anyhow, I've been told time is up, so thank you very much, gentlemen, for your consideration. Thanks to the Asan Institute. Thank you very much.